Ben Shapiro just posted a takedown of Zohran Mamdani's housing plan, so I thought it would be interesting to go over because, as a progressive, I don't think it's the best plan either, but I have a feeling Ben Shapiro is going to misrepresent it. Let's take a look at this video.
Mamdani says that the solution to affordable housing in New York will be for the city to buy up housing from private owners. Presumably, he would do it through eminent domain or something.
That's actually not his policy. His policy is building 200,000 units through public financing. He does not have expropriation or using eminent domain in his policy, and that would be kind of murky in the courts, just expropriating housing just to have public housing. Usually it's for a highway or something like that, but maybe it's possible, but that's not his solution. He wants to build housing and have it under the public sector domain and then have it rent controlled. And I have some problems with that second part, as I just said. Well, I'll see if Ben Shapiro explains it, though.
And then make it city run, because nothing has succeeded like city run housing. It's been working amazing for decades. We've never tried government housing before. It never results in slums. It never results in horrible living conditions, people abusing their housing. It's always just glorious. I mean,
everything you just mentioned is a function of how much money the government chooses to put into the project. The government does not have a shortage of resources or money. It can put as much into these projects as it wants. Now, the government should, for a best principle, be efficient with its resources, but if you're saying that they're just cheap housing, then that's not correct. Government does not have to hold back on financing. The issue is in the distribution mechanisms or rent control policies that do not respect the shortages in the markets that they create. If the controlled rents are significantly or detectably lower than the market rent, that will create issues and that will not create any consumer surplus. It is pretty much literally impossible unless the difference is too small to even detect.
Every place government housing is tried, it just works amazing. Well, speaking of public housing, I asked our sponsors and friends over at Comet, which is a project of perplexity, to tell me about the public housing failures of the 60s and 70s in the U.S., just as a reminder. And here's what Comet says. Public housing in the United States during the 1960s and 70s is widely considered a policy failure because of a combination of social, economic...
Yeah, and all the reasons they list here are exactly what I was just talking about. It's government efforts to reduce costs in buildings. It is, a chronic underfunding, the first bullet point, right? So that is easily amendable. Ben Shapiro is attacking the government's ability to do stuff competently. And that is a reasonable complaint in some areas, but it is not an absolute complaint. The government can absolutely build quality housing. I just don't know if he's going to get to talking about the actual policies of Zohran Mamdani that are problematic here.
And political factors that led to the decline of many developments and widespread negative outcomes for residents. Causes of public housing failure include chronic underfunding and federal disinvestment. Authorities often placed public housing projects in already impoverished, racially segregated neighborhoods, worsening poverty and social isolation. Government efforts to reduce construction costs resulted in buildings that suffered from poor design and insufficient maintenance projects. Strict eligibility rules evicted families that saw even modest financial improvement, concentrating the poorest and most vulnerable populations together while driving out stable working-class tenants. And if you think none of this is going to happen, you're out of your mind. A lot of this is going to happen because...
Well, none of it's going to happen if he gets the funding he needs, right? You don't have problems with maintenance there. You don't have problems with anything else. The government can very easily keep that up. The problem is, how are you going to decide who gets this housing? Right? That is a very hard question to answer. Because if you were actually going to go the route of providing below market housing, how are you going to provide who gets those below market rents? And then once people do get them, you have to realize that that is a subsidy of those people at the expense of incoming tenants who are willing to pay a higher price because they are extracting a higher level of utility from living in New York City. Whether that's because they work a more productive job or they're willing to, live on less, right? That is something that we have to consider here. Now, the policy I would recommend is not a subsidy of current tenants at the expense of future tenants, but rather an arbitrage between social classes, right? Not based on which tenant is there right now and which isn't, because that's not extremely progressive if you even think about it. I would propose subsidizing certain groups in the bidding process, because at the end of the day, we're going to give units to the highest bidder. This is New York City we're talking about. People are going to have to pay more than they will in like Toledo, or I don't even know if the living expenses are there, but like in the middle of Nebraska, right? Anyone's going to admit that, right? They're going to have to sacrifice, they're going to have to be more productive, they're going to have to work more hours, whatever. But we can subsidize, families, single mothers, people with very, very low incomes, and give them more vouchers or subsidies so that when they go to the bidding table, they have more of a shot, right? That is something that we can do that still complies with market mechanisms. If those people, right, if the single mother can outcompete a more productive single man, right, who doesn't have to take care of a child, then that is a net positive for society, even though that single man is working a more productive job. Because that single mother, I'm talking about the single man doesn't have a child, so I'm talking about like a family here. That mother wouldn't be forced to move, right? So that is an example of a policy that would follow market mechanisms and be progressive.
As it turns out, if you try to keep costs down, you end up basically doing it on the cheap, and then the housing is crap. If you try to use it as a labor program, you end up paying way too much, and at that point, you're impoverishing the taxpayer. And if you have no standards as to who is living there, people end up wrecking the housing because they don't actually own.
Well, all of that's like nonsensical, right? The government, nothing's stopping the government from paying too little, paying too much, or having standards. It's just a political question, really. This is what the government non-interventionists constantly, they truly don't think that the government has any ability to be competent, even though they have all the resources in the world and they can hire all the best expertise in the world. It's not the government's fault, it's the government's expertise, right? It's the politicians' fault. They're not diverting to expertise enough. You can see that with California's railroad policy or project, right? People voted on a ballot. I think my parents voted in it. I wasn't born yet. It was going to just connect like two places in California, but then what people voted for ended up like connecting like tons and tons of cities in California. And the French company, I think, that was going to do it said, we're out, that's impossible. And then they were like stuck because like none of these companies are going to build it for us. And then it's been a disaster ever since. That's off the back of my head. I don't know if that's exactly the story, but it's something like that. The politicians or the voters bit off more than they can chew. And that is a political problem. That's not necessarily a capability as a government problem. The government can be highly competent if it chooses to.
Who is living there, people end up wrecking the housing because they don't actually own the housing and they're not even responsible for what happens to the housing they live in. And so, as comment points out, public housing projects became increasingly associated.
That's another issue. The government should be able and willing to evict tenants. I think many tenant protections go too far. If there's property damage, you should evict the tenants. That is one of these safeguards that is guaranteed when the government offloads these properties to private owners. Along with, in my estimation, a more efficient market mechanism with the rent price. Now there are downsides. We should certainly control for owners who don't follow market mechanisms, who aren't in a free market, who coordinate prices with other landlords. I think that is drastically overplayed by some progressives. It might not even be detectable, to be honest. I don't even know if any econometric paper has ever detected that, or study has ever seen that was the case. But if that is the case, then it's minor. It's definitely small. So it's not worth throwing out the whole market mechanism to stop that. But we should go after it in whatever way we can through antitrust, like local laws.
With crime, drugs, and gang activity as a result of concentrated poverty and lack of employment opportunities. Some of the biggest examples include the famous Prout Ego Complex in St. Louis, Missouri. There are entire books that have been written about this complex. It's a disaster area. So I'm glad that New York has decided to do all this again. How could it go wrong?
Yeah, it probably might go wrong. The prices of the non-controlled units are going to go up. This is not going to be good for affordability because Zohran Mamdani is not a big private development person. He's not willing to change the zoning codes that significantly. Right? He's not willing to offload to the private sector. So, there could be more building to offset the increased cost of the non-controlled units, but that's highly theoretical because it's almost impossible to build in New York City, which is why government-built housing, in my estimation, is more efficient, because the government within itself knows the regulations. It can navigate them better than the developers who don't want to take that risk in a highly, controlled space like New York City. They'd rather build elsewhere like Austin. We've seen a lot of housing success there, where it's easier to navigate, I believe, by most developers' opinions. And developers play a huge role in this. I know a lot of progressives also say, developers are this is all just a benefit of the developers. The abundance agenda just loves developers. And it's like the government has to pay developers too. It's like the government does not know how to build housing. They have to outsource that through their money, through their resources, right? So the government housing utilizes the private sector in some way anyways, right? Everything is a market mechanism. We live in a financial capitalism, the kind of system that progressives, even like people call themselves socialists who aren't really socialists, like AOC and Bernie Sanders. They all promote a version of financial capitalism, whether they think they do or they don't. Government programs are just another market intervention. And a market intervention is not throwing out the market, and we should not treat it as such, because then we come up with silly policies like rent control, which are a zero-sum game, right? No net surplus. Much better policy than tariffs, which are a negative sum game, really, because you get a net negative consumer surplus and no producer surplus, because decreased imports due to the import taxes will end up decreasing the exports due to financial flows out of the country and back into the country, and net rise in the dollar. But whatever, that's how trade works. But pretty decent video. A lot of this is just examples of government incompetence, right? You can come up with any example you want of government incompetence, because the government is such a massive organism. It's bound to fail at some points, but we should also recognize the massive benefits of government. Like the libertarians, they fail to recognize the clear benefits, like the judicial system, roads, post office, healthcare of a government, like protecting private property, right? Whereas on the other side of the aisle, you have these super lefties. I think Zohran fits into that category, who refuse to acknowledge the immeasurable surplus that wealthy people have bestowed upon society. Both can be true. I think rich people are wonderful. I also think the government is wonderful. Why I subscribe to modern monetary theory. You can watch my video about the national debt if you want like a high level, like 30,000 mile, view of modern monetary theory. Very simple explanation in regards to the national debt. Over there, I have a video on that. But that is why I subscribe to that theory, because it is, how do you run financial capitalism? It is not, we should tear the system down. That's it.